Martin Castellano pushed open the door to his grandfather's attic on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the funeral. The hinges protested with a metallic groan that echoed through the cramped space, filled with cardboard boxes and forgotten memories. His boss had delivered the news that morning with an apologetic smile. The promotion was going to someone else. 5th time in 7 years. Martin had nodded, returned to his station at the Portland restaurant where he worked as assistant manager, and finished his shift with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd stopped expecting anything different. Now, surrounded by dust particles dancing in the pale afternoon light, he pulled a leather journal from beneath a stack of old newspapers. His grandfather's handwriting covered the pages, not diary entries, but observations. Notes about people, about work, about life. Martin flipped through randomly, and one passage made him stop breathing. Watched Jimmy Petrosky today at the mill. 20 years he's operated the same machine. 20 years of showing up, pulling levers, collecting paychecks. Good man, works hard. But he operates that machine the exact same way he did on day one. Never studies it, never thinks about it after hours, never asks why things are done a certain way. He's put in 20 years of experience, or has he put in 1 year of experience 20 times? There's a difference. The difference is everything. Martin read it again, then a third time. The words felt like they'd reached through time specifically to grab him by the throat. He thought about his own routine, 7 years of opening the same way, managing staff the same way, handling problems the same way. 7 years, or 1 year 7 times, his phone buzzed. A text from his roommate asking if he'd picked up groceries. Martin ignored it and kept reading. Another entry, dated 15 years earlier, met a carpenter today named Wilhelm. 63 years old, still carries a notebook. Everywhere. Still sketches joint designs at breakfast. Still gets excited showing me a new technique he learned. He told me something I won't forget. The day you think you've mastered something is the day you stop improving. And the day you stop improving is the day you start dying. He's been building furniture for 45 years and still considers himself a student. That's why his work sells for 10 times what others charge. Martin set the journal down and looked around the attic. His grandfather had been a tool and die maker, nothing glamorous, nothing that made headlines, but companies had fought over him. He'd retired with 3 different firms begging him to stay on as a consultant. Martin had always assumed his grandfather was just naturally talented, born with some gift for precision and craft. These pages told a different story. They revealed a man who'd studied excellence deliberately, hunted it down like a detective following clues. Page after page contained observations about people who'd mastered their fields. Not celebrities or business moguls, ordinary people doing ordinary work at extraordinary levels. A night janitor who'd systematized his cleaning route so efficiently that he finished a 12-hour job in 8 and spent the remaining time reading technical manuals. A waitress who'd memorized every regular customer's preferences and turned a minimum wage job into management offers from competing restaurants. A postal worker who designed his own sorting method and cut his route time by 40%. His grandfather hadn't just noticed these people. He'd studied them, interviewed them, recorded their habits, their thinking patterns, their daily routines, and then this was the part that made Martin's chest tighten. He'd implemented what he'd learned. The journal contained weekly self-assessments, adjustments to technique, experiments with new approaches, failures documented and analyzed, successes broken down into repeatable, one entry from 30 years ago. Tried Richardson's method for checking tolerances today. Felt awkward, slower than my usual approach, wanted to quit and go back to what I know. But that's exactly the trap. Comfort is the enemy of excellence. Stayed with it. By end of shift, I'd found 2 defects I would have missed using my old method. 2 defects that would have caused machine failures down the line. How many have I missed over the years by sticking with good enough? The question bothers me. Good. Martin stood up, journal in hand, and walked to the small attic window. Outside, Portland's gray afternoon light filtered through Douglas firs. People were living their lives down there, driving to jobs, running errands, going through motions. How many of them, he wondered, were stuck in the same loop he'd been trapped in? Showing up, doing the work, collecting the check, repeat. Wondering why others advanced while they stayed still. Blaming luck, connections, talent, circumstances. The truth his grandfather had discovered and documented was simpler and more uncomfortable. Excellence was a choice, not a gift. It required doing things most people weren't willing to do. Not dramatic things, not heroic sacrifices, just consistent, deliberate, uncomfortable things, studying when others relaxed, practicing when others socialized, analyzing when others assumed, questioning when others accepted. Martin turned to a page near the journal's end, written just 2 years before his grandfather's death. Young people today ask me how I got so good at my work. They want a secret, a shortcut, a trick. I tell them the truth and watch their faces fall. There is no secret. There's only decision. The decision to treat every single day as an opportunity to improve by some small measure. The decision to be uncomfortable on purpose. The decision to never be satisfied with good enough when better is possible. They don't like this answer because it means excellence is available to anyone, which also means their current mediocrity is a choice they're making. That's a hard thing to accept. Martin closed the journal and held it against his chest. The attic suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. He thought about tomorrow, Wednesday, another shift, another day of routine. He could show up the same way he had for 7 years, collect his paycheck, go home, watch television, repeat. Nobody would judge him. That's what most people did. It was acceptable, normal, safe. Or he could make a different choice. The choice his grandfather had made decades ago in a factory in Michigan, surrounded by machines and men who'd accepted their limitations. The choice that separated those who became the best from those who stayed average. Not a choice made once, but made every single day, in 1,000 small moments nobody else would ever see or applaud. Martin descended the attic stairs with the journal tucked under his arm. His hands weren't shaking, but something fundamental had shifted behind his eyes. Tomorrow morning, he would arrive at the restaurant differently, not with grand announcements or dramatic changes, but with a question he'd never seriously asked himself before. What would it take to become the absolute best at what I do? Not someday. Starting now. The answer, he suspected, was waiting in the pages he hadn't yet read. Victoria Hammond sat at her piano in a cramped Melbourne apartment, staring at the same beginner's exercise book she'd been teaching from for 8 years. Outside, rain drummed against the window with rhythmic persistence. Inside, the silence between her and the instrument felt heavier than usual. Her last student had just canceled the 3rd one this month. Parents were polite about it, always offering reasonable explanations. Their child needed to focus on other subjects, schedule conflicts, budget constraints. But Victoria knew the real reason: she wasn't producing results. Her students participated in recitals where they performed adequately, never excellently. They learned to play songs, but never truly learned to play piano. She ran her fingers across the keys without pressing them down, feeling the smooth ivory beneath her skin. 12 years of classical training. A degree from a respected conservatory. Thousands of hours of practice. Yet somehow, she'd become exactly what she'd promised herself: she'd never be a mediocre teacher producing mediocre students. The rain intensified. Victoria grabbed her jacket and walked out into the wet afternoon, no destination in mind, just needing to move. Her feet carried her through unfamiliar streets, until she found herself in an industrial area she'd never explored before. Small workshops lined the road: upholsterers, metal workers, custom furniture makers. She stopped outside, one where warm light spilled onto the pavement. Through the window, she watched an elderly man bent over a workbench, hands moving with deliberate precision across a piece of timber. Something about his focus pulled her inside. The workshop smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. The man looked up, his weathered face creased with curiosity rather than annoyance at the interruption. "Help you with something?" Victoria realized she had no reason to be there. "I'm sorry, I was just walking and saw you working. I'll go. You play piano." He said it as a statement, not a question. She glanced down at her hands, surprised. "How did you know?" "Calluses in specific places." "Posture." Musicians carry themselves differently. He returned to his work, using a small plane to shave thin curls from the wood. "I'm Henry Moss. Been building instruments for 46 years. Mainly guitars and violins now." Victoria introduced herself, then watched him work in silence. Each stroke of the plane removed exactly the same thickness of wood. No hesitation, no correction, just pure, intentional movement. "You measure each stroke?" she finally asked. Henry chuckled. "Haven't measured in 30 years, but I did measure obsessively for the first 16. 16 years of measuring? Every single cut, every joint, every angle. He held up the piece of wood, examining it against the light. Most people think mastery means you eventually stop needing to pay attention. Truth is opposite. Mastery means you've paid such careful attention for so long that precision becomes automatic. But it starts with measurement, with awareness, with knowing exactly what you're doing and why. He set down the plane and pulled out a worn notebook filled with sketches and numbers. This is from 1979. First year I went out on my own. See these notes? I documented every single instrument I built, logged how long each step took, recorded which techniques worked and which didn't. When something failed, I wrote down why. When something succeeded, I broke down exactly what I'd done so I could repeat it. Victoria leaned closer, studying the meticulous entries. You kept records of everything? Everything that mattered. See, most craftsmen I knew would build something, and if it turned out well, they'd say, I've got a good feel for it. If it turned out poorly, they'd blame the wood or the weather or their tools, but they never really knew why things worked or didn't work. They were guessing, hoping their instincts would improve with time. He flipped to another page, covered in detailed measurements and annotations. I decided I wouldn't guess. I'd know. So I treated every instrument like an experiment, changed one variable at a time, documented the results, built feedback loops into everything I did. Feedback loops? Henry picked up a half-finished guitar body. After I finish an instrument, I follow up with the buyer 6 months later. Ask specific questions about sound quality, playability, durability. Most builders never do this. They hand off their work and move to the next project. But that follow-up tells me what's actually working in the real world, not just in my workshop. That information feeds back into my next build. He ran his hand along the guitar's curved edge. Here's what nobody tells you about getting good at something. Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. If you practice the wrong things, you get really good at doing things wrong. What matters isn't how much time you put in. It's whether you're practicing with awareness, with intention, with feedback telling you if you're actually improving. Victoria felt something shift in her chest. She thought about her own practice routine, hours spent playing pieces she already knew, reinforcing existing patterns, never pushing into discomfort. She thought about her teaching methods, using the same exercises her own teachers had used, never questioning whether they were actually effective. I've been practicing piano since I was 6 years old, she said quietly. But I'm not sure I've ever really practiced deliberately. Henry nodded. Most people haven't. They put in time, they go through motions, but they're not engineering improvement. They're not isolating weaknesses and attacking them specifically. They're not creating conditions where growth is inevitable. He walked to a corner of the workshop, where several guitars hung on the wall. These are my early instruments. I keep them to remind myself where I started. This one here, he pointed to a beautiful mahogany guitar I built in my 3rd year. Looks impressive, doesn't it? But the intonation is slightly off on the upper frets. I didn't discover that until years later when I'd developed better diagnostic skills. I thought I was doing excellent work. I was actually producing flawed instruments and didn't have the awareness to realize it. Victoria stared at the guitar, seeing her own teaching reflected in its polished but imperfect surface. Henry continued, the breakthrough came when I started breaking down mastery into components. I stopped trying to build guitars and started focusing on individual skills. 1 month, I'd concentrate purely on neck angles, build 20 necks, each one a slight variation, measuring and comparing results. Next month, bridge placement, then fret installation, then finish application. I isolated each element and pursued precision in that specific area. That must have been tedious. Extremely. Also effective. Within 5 years of starting that approach, my instruments were selling for triple what they'd commanded before. Within 10 years, I had a 2-year waiting list. Not because I was talented, plenty of talented builders produced mediocre work, but because I'd systematized improvement. I'd made excellence a process, rather than hoping it would happen accidentally. Victoria pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. Can I write some of this down? Write down everything. That's the first step, documenting what you're currently doing so you can see it clearly. Most people operate on autopilot, then wonder why. They're not progressing. You can't improve what you're not aware of. She typed quickly, capturing his words. Henry returned to his workbench and picked up the plane again. You know what separates people who become the best from people who plateau? He asked, returning to his precise strokes. It's not talent, It's not even work ethic, though that matters. It's the willingness to be a beginner over and over again. Every time I learn a new technique, I'm terrible at it initially. My ego hates that. My hands want to return to familiar patterns. But growth lives in that discomfort. Excellence requires repeatedly leaving the zone where you're competent and entering the zone where you're incompetent. Victoria watched him work for another 20 minutes, neither of them speaking. When she finally left the workshop, the rain had stopped. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement, turning the industrial street into something almost beautiful. She walked home with Henry's notebook entries, burned into her memory. That evening, she opened a fresh journal and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Below it, she documented her current teaching methods in brutal detail, every exercise she used, every explanation she gave, every assumption she'd been making about how students learn. Tomorrow, she would begin the real work. Not the work of teaching piano, but the work of learning how to teach piano. The work of measuring, documenting, isolating variables, creating feedback loops, the work that nobody saw but everyone who achieved mastery had done. Her students deserved a teacher who was still learning. She deserved to become the musician she'd always assumed she'd somehow automatically become. The journal waited on her piano, its blank pages hungry for data. Andre Luanga's fingers hovered over the keyboard at 3 a.m, the blue glow of his monitor illuminating the cramped Nairobi apartment he shared with 2 roommates. He'd been debugging the same function for 6 hours, chasing an error that seemed to materialize and vanish like a ghost in the machine. His coffee had gone cold, his eyes burned, and somewhere in the fog of exhaustion, a realization crystallized. He'd seen this exact problem before. Not once, dozens of times. Different projects, different code, but the same fundamental mistake. He wasn't learning from his errors. He was repeating them with minor variations, convinced each time that this particular situation was unique. Andre leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. 3 years out of university, 3 years of freelance development work, 3 years of feeling like he was running on a treadmill, expending enormous energy while staying in exactly the same place. Other developers he'd graduated with were landing senior positions, leading teams, building applications that attracted real users and real money. Meanwhile, Andre was still grinding through basic projects, still making rookie mistakes, still wondering why excellence felt so impossibly distant. He closed his laptop and pulled out his phone, scrolling through a developer forum he frequented. Someone had posted a question about architectural patterns, the kind of sophisticated problem Andre wished he was skilled enough to tackle. The top response came from a developer named Catherine O'Ching, whose username Andre recognized. She'd answered hundreds of questions on the forum, each response demonstrating depth of understanding Andre envied. On impulse, he clicked through to her profile. She'd linked to her GitHub repository. Andre opened it and started examining her code. The structure was clean, elegant, efficient. Comments explained not just what the code did, but why certain approaches were chosen over alternatives. Commit messages told the story of her thinking process, showing how she'd identified problems and iterated toward solutions. Andre spent the next hour studying her projects, taking notes on patterns he observed. How she organized files, how she handled errors, how she structured functions for reusability. He wasn't copying her code, he was decoding her methodology, reverse engineering the thinking that produced such polished results. Dawn broke outside his window, painting the Nairobi sky in shades of orange and pink. Andre opened a new document and wrote at the top, "What would Catherine do differently?" Then he returned to his own troubled project and looked at it through that lens. Within 15 minutes he'd identified the core issue, not the surface bug he'd been chasing, but a fundamental structural flaw in how he'd approached the entire problem. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. He'd been trying to figure everything out alone, as if mastery required isolated discovery. But Catherine and every other excellent developer he admired hadn't invented programming from scratch. They'd studied how others solved problems. They'd absorbed proven patterns. They'd stood on the shoulders of people who'd already climbed the mountain. Over the following weeks, Andre became a student of excellence. He identified the 10 best developers in his specific niche, not celebrities, but working professionals producing consistently outstanding work. He studied their code repositories. He watched their conference talks. He read their blog posts and technical documentation. He joined online communities where they participated and observed how they approached problems, asked questions, and explained concepts. But Andre didn't stop at observation. He began a practice he called comparative analysis. Each evening, he'd write a function or solve a problem using his current approach. Then he'd find how one of his selected models had solved something similar. He'd compare the two side by side, documenting the differences. Where had they seen elegance while he'd settled for functionality? Where had they anticipated edge cases he'd missed? Where had they applied patterns he didn't know existed? His notebook filled with these comparisons. Catherine uses dependency injection here, allows for easier testing. I hard-coded the dependency brittle, difficult to modify. Johan broke this complex function into 5 smaller ones, each does one thing perfectly. My version tries to do everything, harder to debug, impossible to reuse. Amara added comprehensive error handling at the boundaries, graceful failures. My code crashes when given unexpected input. The improvements came faster than Andre had thought possible, not because he was copying others, but because he was learning to see problems through expert eyes. He was acquiring their frameworks, their mental models, their instinct for what worked. Each project became an opportunity to ask, how would someone excellent approach this? 6 months into this practice, Andre received a message through the developer forum. Catherine Ochieng, the programmer whose work he'd been studying, had noticed his recent contributions to an open-source project. Your code quality has improved dramatically. What changed? Andre told her the truth. How he'd been stuck in mediocrity, spinning his wheels. How he'd started studying her work and the work of other exceptional developers. How he'd built a system for learning from their examples. Her response surprised him. You discovered what took me years to figure out. I went through the same transformation when I was where you are now. I was struggling, frustrated, convinced I lacked natural talent. Then I started studying developers I admired. I realized they weren't geniuses, they just learned patterns I hadn't learned yet. Once I had access to those patterns, progress accelerated exponentially. She continued, here's what most people miss. Every field is built on accumulated knowledge. The best performers aren't starting from zero. They're learning from everyone who came before them. They're finding the shortest path between where they are and where they want to be by following trails others have already blazed. That's not cheating. That's intelligent strategy. Andre printed out her message and pinned it above his desk. Below it, he added a quote he'd found in his research, attributed to a scientist from centuries ago. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. The practice expanded beyond code. Andre identified excellent communicators and studied how they explained technical concepts. He found developers who'd successfully transitioned to leadership roles and analyzed their career paths. He located people who'd built sustainable freelance businesses and reverse-engineered their strategies. Each model offered lessons, patterns, frameworks he could adapt to his own situation. His income doubled within 8 months. Not because he suddenly worked twice as hard, he'd always worked hard, but because he was now working smart, applying proven methodologies instead of reinventing solutions to already solved problems. Clients noticed the difference. His code was cleaner, more maintainable, delivered faster. He was solving problems at a level that had seemed impossibly advanced just a year earlier. Andre received an offer from a tech startup, a senior developer position with a team to mentor. During the interview, the CTO asked him what accounted for his rapid improvement. I stopped trying to figure everything out alone, Andre said. I found people who were already excellent and learned how they think. I studied their work like a detective studying evidence. I didn't copy them, I learned from them. There's a difference. The CTO nodded, a slight smile crossing her face. That's exactly the mindset we need here. Most developers protect their ignorance with ego. They don't want to admit others might know more. You've learned what separates the good from the great, the willingness to model excellence wherever you find it. Andre accepted the position. His first day, he started a document for his new team, a curated list of exceptional developers to study. With notes on what made each one worth learning from, he titled it Standing on Shoulders, a Guide to Accelerated Mastery. At the bottom, he added one line in bold, Excellence leaves clues. Your job is to find them and follow where they lead. Gerda Volkov pressed the record button on her camera, then immediately stopped. The viewfinder displayed exactly what she'd feared, another competent but forgettable shot. Technically adequate, creatively empty. She set the camera down on the Mumbai rooftop where she'd been filming and watched the sun sink toward the Arabian Sea. 2 years into her documentary filmmaking career, Gerda had accumulated an impressive collection of almost good enough work. Projects that clients accepted without enthusiasm. films that audiences watched without remembering. She'd convinced herself that breakthrough success required luck, connections, circumstances beyond her control. Anything except confronting the uncomfortable truth. She was holding back. Not in effort, she worked constantly, but in commitment. Real commitment, the kind that required sacrifice she'd been unwilling to make. Her phone rang. A potential client calling about a corporate video safe work. Decent money, zero creative challenge. Gerda declined the call. Something had broken inside her during the past week while editing her latest documentary. She'd watched the rough cut and felt nothing. Months of filming, countless hours of work, and she'd produced something that would disappear without trace the moment it premiered. That evening, Gerda pulled out notebooks she'd been keeping for the past 6 months. After reading about Martin's grandfather, studying Victoria's deliberate practice methods, and learning from Andre's modeling strategy, she'd begun implementing similar approaches. She'd documented her filming techniques. She'd studied cinematographers whose work moved her. She'd broken down what made great documentaries transcendent rather than merely informative. But something was still missing. She had the knowledge, she had the frameworks, she understood the principles of excellence. Yet her work remained stubbornly mediocre. Gerda opened her laptop and searched for interviews with filmmakers she admired. Not the famous ones, the working professionals producing consistently powerful films on modest budgets. She watched a documentary filmmaker named Hiroshi Nakamura discuss his process. One section made her pause and replay. "People ask me how I maintain quality while working quickly," Hiroshi said. "The answer makes them uncomfortable. I've eliminated everything from my life that doesn't serve my craft. I don't attend social events unless they're essential. I don't watch television. I don't pursue hobbies. For 15 years, I've devoted virtually every waking hour to becoming better at what I do. Not because I'm obsessed or unbalanced, but because excellence in any field demands prices most people aren't willing to pay." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "You cannot have everything. You cannot be excellent at your craft while also maintaining the lifestyle of someone who treats work as just a job." The best in any field have made sacrifices others refuse to make. They've said no to comfort, to leisure, to immediate gratification. They've chosen long-term mastery over short-term pleasure. That's not a judgment, it's mathematics. Time and energy are finite. How you allocate them determines your results. Gerda closed the laptop and looked around her apartment. Comfortable furniture, large television, shelves filled with books she'd bought but never read. A kitchen equipped for elaborate cooking she rarely did. The trappings of a balanced life. Also, she realized with sudden clarity, the infrastructure of mediocrity. She wasn't willing to be uncomfortable. Not truly. She practiced her craft, but within boundaries that preserved her comfort. She'd study for an hour, then reward herself with entertainment. She'd push herself creatively, but not so far that it created real strain. She'd been trying to become excellent while also maintaining the easy rhythms of an ordinary life. That night, Gerda made decisions that frightened her. She canceled her streaming subscriptions. She committed to waking at 5 every morning to study cinematography before her shoots. She identified the 3 documentary filmmakers whose work most inspired her and mapped out a plan to analyze one of their films each week, shot by shot. Understanding every creative choice, she scheduled her entire week around improvement, blocking time for deliberate practice the way others block time for meetings. Most significantly, she turned down every project that didn't push her abilities. The corporate videos, the safe commercial work, the jobs that paid well but taught nothing. If a project wouldn't force her to grow, she refused it. Even when her bank account protested. Even when fear whispered about financial security. The transformation didn't feel empowering. It felt brutal. Gerda spent weeks with almost no income, investing every hour in developing skills she should have mastered years earlier. She studied lighting until she could predict how any scene would look before setting up equipment. She practiced interviewing techniques until drawing out authentic emotion became instinctive. She analyzed pacing and structure until she could feel in her bones whether a sequence would work. Friends stopped inviting her to gatherings after she declined repeatedly. Family members expressed concern about her intensity. Former colleagues suggested she was taking things too seriously, burning herself out, losing perspective. But something was happening to her work. The first documentary she produced, under this new regime of total commitment, a short film about street vendors in Mumbai, One, acceptance to a film festival she'd never dreamed of entering. The second attracted an international distributor. The third led to a commission from a major streaming platform. 12 months after that rooftop evening where she'd almost given up, Gerda stood at the same location filming sunrise. Her camera captured something she couldn't have created a year earlier, not because the equipment had changed, but because she had changed. She'd paid prices others weren't willing to pay. She'd sacrificed comforts others considered non-negotiable. She'd committed to excellence without reservation or excuse. Her phone buzzed with a message from a filmmaker whose work she'd studied obsessively. "Saw your latest documentary. You found something rare. Keep going." Gerda smiled and returned to filming. The city was waking below her, millions of people beginning another day. Some would go through motions, repeating patterns, wondering why success eluded them. Others would make different choices, uncomfortable choices, committed choices. The difference between those groups wasn't talent or luck or circumstance. It was decision, the decision to become excellent, the decision to pay whatever price excellence demanded, the decision made not once but every single day. In 1,000 small moments when comfort beckoned and growth required pain, Gerda had made her decision. The camera kept rolling, capturing light,